October 17, 1978. That was the day they found Carol Bonnet's body. He was 61 years old, an employee at Clarkson Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. Someone had stabbed him inside his apartment, stolen his wallet and his car, and left a taunting note for the police. For 33 years, that date meant only one thing: the day Carol Bonnet was found dead on the floor of his downtown apartment with no one held accountable. Omaha detectives had fingerprints from the crime scene. Good prints. Clean prints from a bathroom door, from beer cans, from the medicine cabinet. They had every reason to believe those prints would solve the case. But in 1978, there was no national fingerprint database. There was no way to search millions of records at once. There was nothing to do but compare prints by hand, one suspect at a time, and hope for a lucky break. That break did not come for 3 decades. When it finally did, it came from a database that did not exist when Carol Bonnet was alive, triggered by a fax from a law enforcement office in Florida and confirmed by DNA technology that would not be invented for another decade after the murder. And the sentencing? October 17, 2011. Exactly 33 years to the day after Bonnet's body was discovered. The judge handed Jerry Watson a life sentence on the same calendar date that Carol Bonnet's life was taken from him. Some cases close. This one came full circle. This is the story of Omaha's oldest cold case, how it went unsolved for a generation, and how a single fingerprint, patient evidence, and one determined crime lab technician brought it back from the dead. If this is your first time on the channel, Cold Case Redemption covers the cases that everyone thought would stay buried, and the people who refuse to let them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Before Carol Bonnet became a case number, before his apartment became a crime scene, before his name was filed away in a cardboard evidence box, he was a person. Carol Bonnet was born on January 13, 1917. By the fall of 1978, he was 61 years old and living alone in a downtown Omaha apartment. He worked at Bishop Clarkson Hospital, one of the oldest medical institutions in the city. Every available account of his home describes it the same way: orderly, neat, the kind of place that reflected a man who kept his life in manageable order. Downtown Omaha in the late 1970s was a different place than it is today. The old market district was still finding its identity, its brick warehouses slowly being converted into shops and restaurants. The streets around Clarkson Hospital were lined with apartment buildings and small businesses. The kind of neighborhood where people walked to the corner store and recognized their neighbors by face, if not always by name. It was a part of the city that felt lived in, modest, unremarkable. The kind of place where a working man could afford rent and be close enough to walk to his job. Bishop Clarkson Hospital itself had been a fixture of Omaha since the late 1800s. By the 1970s, it was a well-respected medical center, the kind of institution that employed hundreds of people in roles ranging from surgeons to custodians. Bonnet was among them. The historical record doesn't specify his exact title, only that he was an employee. What we know is that he showed up consistently enough that 2 missed shifts raised immediate concern among his co-workers. Bonnet fit into that world quietly. He went to work. He came home. He kept to himself for the most part. But he also had a social side. He was a regular at local bars in the downtown area, and people who knew him described a man who was generous, sometimes to a fault. He would buy drinks for people at the bar. He would strike up conversations with strangers. On more than one occasion, he let people he had met stay at his apartment or borrow his car. He had a 1964 Buick that he let acquaintances use from time to time. That generosity tells you something about who Carol Bonnet was. He was a man who trusted the people around him. He opened his door, literally and figuratively, to people who needed something. In a different story, that quality would make him admirable. In this story, it made him vulnerable. By October of 1978, at least 2 men had stayed in his apartment in recent months. One of them had a key to his car at the time of his death. Bonnet's life was small, routine, and unremarkable in the way that most lives are. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He was a 61-year-old man who went to work at a hospital and came home to a clean apartment in downtown Omaha. On October 15, 1978, something shattered that routine. And when he did not show up for his shift at Clarkson Hospital on October 16th, nobody raised an alarm. Not yet. He missed another day on October 17th. That is when a coworker decided to check on him. By then, it was already too late. If you have watched this far, you are the kind of person who stays until the case is solved. Like this video if you think Carol Bonnet's story deserves to be told. And let us keep going. On October 17, 1978, one of Carol Bonnet's colleagues at Clarkson Hospital grew concerned. 2 days of missed shifts with no phone call, no explanation. That was unusual for a man as dependable as Bonnet. The co-worker contacted the manager of Bonnet's apartment building and asked them to check on him. The manager walked to Bonnet's door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Then the manager crouched down and looked through the mail slot on the front door. Through the narrow opening, he could see Bonnet lying on the floor inside the apartment. He appeared to be face down, either injured or unconscious. The manager immediately called for an ambulance. When the Omaha Fire Department arrived, they forced the door open. Carol Bonnet was lying face down on the floor of his apartment. He was unclothed. He had been stabbed once in the left upper quadrant of his abdomen. A single wound, but a fatal one. The pathologist who later performed the autopsy determined that Bonnet had been dead for more than 48 hours, placing the actual killing around October 15th, 2 full days before anyone came looking for him. The apartment told a story of its own. This was a space that was normally neat, carefully maintained. Now it showed clear signs of a struggle. Newspapers were scattered across the floor. Beer cans sat in the kitchen sink and in the trash. Cigarette butts filled the wastebaskets. 3 towels containing biological evidence, hair, and other material lay near the body. The telephone cord had been severed, cut deliberately so Bonnet couldn't call for help, even if he'd survived the initial attack. His wallet was gone. Whatever cash he'd had on him was gone, and his 1964 Buick was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of forced entry. The door had not been kicked in. The lock was not broken. Whoever killed Carol Bonnet had either been let inside willingly or had a key. Given Bonnet's known habit of inviting acquaintances to his apartment, detectives believed the former was most likely. He'd opened the door for the person who would kill him. And then there was the note. Near the body, investigators found a piece of newspaper with writing on it in blue ink. The message read, "I am leaving this crime with only one clue. Find it yourself, pig." Below that, the words, "Die, pig." And at the bottom, a single word, "Helter." That note changed the character of the crime entirely. This wasn't just a robbery that turned violent. The killer was mocking the police. He was daring them to catch him. He believed he was smarter than every detective who would walk through that door, every technician who would dust for prints, every investigator who would read the case file in the years to come. He wrote a taunting message next to the body of the man he had just killed, and he walked out the front door believing he would never be found. The word "helter" at the bottom of the note carried its own implications. In 1978, Charles Manson had been in prison for less than a decade. The Manson family murders were still recent cultural memory, and Manson's obsession with helter-skelter was widely known. Whether the killer was making a deliberate reference or simply borrowing a word designed to unsettle, the effect was the same. It added a layer of menace to an already violent scene. For 30 years, he was right about one thing. Nobody caught him. This is where the investigation begins, and this is where the first seeds of frustration were planted, because the evidence that would eventually solve this case was sitting right there in that apartment. The detectives just did not have the tools to read it yet. The Omaha Police Department processed the crime scene with the tools available to them in 1978. And in fairness, those tools produced results. A young crime lab technician named Michael Stone arrived at the apartment to collect evidence. Stone was 28 years old at the time. relatively early in what would become a long career with the Omaha Police Crime Lab. He moved through the apartment methodically, photographing the scene, cataloging items, and dusting surfaces for fingerprints. What he found was remarkable in terms of quantity and quality. Latent fingerprints were lifted from the inside surface of the bathroom door. More prints came from the medicine cabinet, from beer cans in the kitchen, from the coffee table in the living room, and from the telephone with its severed cord. The pattern of prints, particularly the concentration on the bathroom door and medicine cabinet, suggested the killer had gone into the bathroom after the stabbing, probably to wash blood off his hands. He had touched the door, reached for the cabinet, and left clean impressions behind. One print in particular stood out. The latent print from the inside of the bathroom door was exceptionally clear, high quality, multiple unique identifying characteristics. It was the kind of print that, under the right circumstances, could absolutely identify a specific individual. Michael Stone initialed the card, filed it, and began the process of comparison. The process in 1978 was entirely manual. There was no computer system to scan prints against a national database. Detectives had to physically compare the unknown prints against fingerprint cards in their own files, one card at a time. Each comparison required a trained examiner to sit with two sets of prints side by side, studying the ridge patterns, the whorls, the loops, the arches, looking for enough points of correspondence to make a positive identification. A single comparison could take minutes. Searching through an entire departmental file could take days or weeks. And that was just Omaha's records. They could also send teletype requests to other law enforcement agencies, asking them to compare the prints against their local records. They did this. Requests went out to agencies across the region and beyond, each one asking the same question. Do these prints match anyone in your files? Nothing matched. Every response came back negative. Meanwhile, Bonnet's stolen car surfaced. On October 19, 1978, just 4 days after the murder, the 1964 Buick was found abandoned on the streets of Cicero, Illinois, a suburb sitting directly west of Chicago. The car was not wearing its original Nebraska plates. Someone had swapped them out for stolen Illinois license plates, plates that had been reported missing on October 16, 1978, just 1 day after the estimated date of the murder. The swap was deliberate, a conscious effort to make the car harder to trace back to Omaha while it crossed state lines. Cicero police processed the vehicle. Inside the car, investigators found more cigarette butts, the same brand of physical evidence that littered the apartment back in Omaha. Only 2 fingerprints from the vehicle were identifiable. One belonged to Carol Bonnet himself. The other was unknown, and it did not match the primary suspect Omaha detectives were looking at. The Cicero discovery was both a lead and a dead end simultaneously. On one hand, it told detectives the killer had driven Bonnet's car more than 450 miles from Omaha to a suburb of Chicago. That suggested the killer was not a local Omaha resident. He was likely someone passing through, someone with connections to the Chicago area, someone who knew where to go when he left town in a stolen car. On the other hand, Cicero in the late 1970s was not a small town where a stranger would stand out. It was a dense suburb with a complicated reputation. Finding a transient killer there, based on an abandoned car and a single unmatched fingerprint, was close to impossible. Omaha detectives did have a suspect at one point. They compared the unknown prints against that person's records. No match. The suspect was cleared, and without the ability to search a broader pool of candidates, the investigation stalled. Michael Stone kept the evidence. He compared that bathroom door print against new records as they came in, hoping for a hit. But the technology of the time simply could not do what the case needed. The prints went into storage, the case file went into a drawer, and Carol Bonnet's murder became one of Omaha's unsolved homicides. The killer had left his fingerprints all over the apartment. He'd left DNA on cigarette butts, on beer cans, and in biological material near the body. He'd left a taunting note daring the police to find his clue. And none of it mattered because in 1978, there was no machine on Earth that could take those prints and tell you who they belonged to unless you already had a name to compare them against. The evidence sat in a box. The box sat in a property room, and the years began to pass. 30 years is not a number. It's a lifetime. When Carol Bonnet was murdered in October 1978, Jimmy Carter was president. The first test tube baby had been born 3 months earlier. The World Series was being played between the Yankees and the Dodgers. The internet did not exist. Cell phones did not exist. DNA profiling would not be developed for another 6 years. The Omaha Police Department did not close Bonnet's case. Technically, murder cases are never closed until they're solved. But there is a difference between a case that is actively worked and a case that sits in a file cabinet waiting for something to change. By the early 1980s, the Bonnet case had crossed that line. Detectives retired. New ones came in. New murders demanded immediate attention. The evidence from the Bonnet crime scene sat in the property room, sealed and preserved, but untouched. The fingerprint cards Michael Stone had so carefully prepared were still there, still legible, still carrying the unique ridge patterns of the man who had killed Carol Bonnet. They just had no name attached to them. During those same decades, the man who left those prints was living his life. Jerry Watson had been 19 years old when he killed Carol Bonnet. He'd grown up in Cicero, Illinois, the same suburb where Bonnet's stolen Buick was recovered just blocks from Watson's neighborhood. In the fall of 1978, Watson had been visiting a relative in Omaha. After the murder, he left Nebraska in Bonnet's car, drove it back to his home territory in Illinois, swapped out the license plates for stolen ones, and abandoned it. Over the following years, Watson drifted. He lived in different states, at times in Florida, at times elsewhere, using alias names to stay ahead of his record. He committed burglaries and was arrested more than once. Each time he was booked, his fingerprints were taken, rolled onto a card, and filed in whatever local or state system was available. His prints existed in databases in Illinois and elsewhere. But those databases were isolated from each other, disconnected islands of criminal records with no bridge between them. A detective in Omaha could not search the booking records of a county jail in Illinois. A state trooper in Florida could not check a fingerprint card against the files of the Omaha Police Department. Every jurisdiction maintained its own records, its own filing system, its own set of cards. And unless an investigator knew to send a specific request to a specific agency, asking about a specific name, those records were invisible to each other. Watson's fingerprints were being collected and stored by law enforcement agencies across the country, and none of them could see the matching prints waiting in an evidence room in Nebraska. Watson had every reason to believe he'd gotten away with it. 30 years had passed, no one had come knocking, no detective had ever called his name. The arrogant note he'd left beside the body, the one daring police to find his clue, seemed more prophetic with every passing year. He'd challenged them, and they hadn't risen to it. What Watson did not know was that the world was building the tool that would undo him. In the 1990s, the FBI began developing the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, known as IAFIS. It was one of the most ambitious law enforcement technology projects in American history. A centralized digital database designed to hold the fingerprint records of every arrested individual in the country and make them searchable from any participating agency. The system launched on July 28, 1999, at a cost of $640 million. By the time it was fully operational, it held the world's largest collection of digital fingerprint records, more than 77 million sets of prints submitted by state, local, and federal agencies. What had once required weeks of manual comparison could now be done in hours. A latent print lifted from a crime scene in Nebraska could be compared against the fingerprint records of every person who had ever been booked into a participating system anywhere in the United States. The transformation was staggering. Before IAFIS, a fingerprint comparison request sent to the FBI took an average of several weeks to process. After IAFIS, electronic submissions could be returned in 2 hours or less. An entire generation of unsolved cases suddenly had a new avenue for resolution. Across the country, cold case units began submitting old evidence to IAFIS and getting hits on cases that had been dormant for years, sometimes decades. The technology that Michael Stone had spent his career waiting for finally existed. But IAFIS did not automatically search old evidence. Someone had to enter those prints into the system. Someone had to remember that the Bonnet case existed, retrieve the old fingerprint cards, and submit them for comparison. And for nearly a decade after IAFIS launched, that did not happen. Michael Stone retired from the Omaha Police Department. By his own account, he had compared the bathroom door print countless times over the years, always hoping for a match. He left the department without one. The evidence that could solve the case was preserved. The technology that could read it was operational. But the two had not been connected. The answer was sitting in a box, waiting for someone to ask the right question. If you're the kind of person who stays with a case until it breaks open, you're in the right place. Hit like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, and it tells us you want to see more cases like this one. In March 2008, the Omaha Police Department did something that changed the trajectory of the Bonnet case. They opened a dedicated cold case unit. For the first time, investigators were assigned specifically to re-examine old, unsolved cases with fresh eyes and modern tools. The Bonnet file was among the cases pulled from storage, but the critical push came from an unexpected direction. In December 2008, the cold case unit received a fax from an unexpected source, the Criminal Laboratory Services section of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The inquiry was straightforward. Had the latent fingerprint evidence from the Carol Bonnet murder ever been searched through modern automated databases and linked to a suspect? The answer was no. Why Florida? Watson had lived in Florida at various points after the murder, using alias names. Whether the Florida inquiry was triggered by a connection to Watson's record, or whether it was part of a broader multi-state cold case review initiative, the publicly available records don't make entirely clear. What is clear is that a single fax from 1,200 miles away triggered the sequence of events that would solve the case. It's worth pausing on the larger point here. 30 years had passed since the murder. IAFIS had been operational for nearly a decade. The prints were in storage, the database was running, and nobody had connected the two. Not because of negligence, not because anyone had forgotten Carol Bonnet, but because the sheer volume of unsolved cases in every police department in the country means that old evidence doesn't automatically get retested when new technology becomes available. Someone has to make the decision. Someone has to do the work. And in this case, it took a prompt from a law enforcement agency 1,200 miles away in Florida to set the process in motion. The cold case unit asked the Omaha Crime Lab to run the prints. Enter Laura Casey. Laura Casey was a senior crime laboratory technician with the Omaha Police Department. She had joined the crime lab in 1995 and earned certification as a crime scene analyst in 2001. By December 2008, she had more than a decade of experience working with fingerprint evidence. She understood what IAFIS could do, and she understood the significance of what she was being asked to search. On December 19, 2008, Casey retrieved the old fingerprint evidence from the Bonnet case. She sat down at her workstation and entered the prints into two systems, the Nebraska State Automated Fingerprint Identification System and the FBI's National IAFIS database. The print she submitted was the same one Michael Stone had lifted from the inside of the bathroom door 30 years earlier. Stone's original work had been meticulous. The print was still clean, still detailed, still carrying enough unique ridge characteristics to make a positive identification if a match existed in the system. Casey entered it into IAFIS. The system began searching. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the scale of what IAFIS was doing. The database held more than 77 million fingerprint records submitted from law enforcement agencies across the United States. When a latent print is entered, the system does not just look for an exact copy. It identifies potential matches based on shared characteristics, then ranks them by probability, and returns a list of candidates for a human examiner to review. The process that once took weeks or months of manual work could now return candidates in hours. In less than 5 hours, IAFIS returned its results. Among the candidate matches was a set of prints belonging to a man named Jerry Watson. Casey began the detailed comparison. She examined the ridge patterns, the minutia points, the unique characteristics of the latent print against Watson's known prints in the system. Over the following days, she worked through the analysis with precision, confirming point after point of correspondence. When she was certain, she reportedly called out to her colleagues in the crime lab, "I think I have a hit on this cold case." 30 years. The print had been sitting in an evidence room for 3 decades. Michael Stone had compared it by hand more times than he could count. And now, because a technician in Florida sent a fax and a technician in Omaha entered the print into a computer, the system returned a name in less time than it takes to drive across the city. Jerry Watson. Born and raised in Cicero, Illinois. A career burglar with multiple arrests. His prints had entered the IAFIS system through those later arrests, booking records from crimes committed years after the Bonnet murder. The very criminal career Watson had continued to pursue after killing Carol Bonnet was what ultimately put his fingerprints into the database that identified him. But a fingerprint match is the beginning of a case, not the end of one. A name is not a conviction. The Omaha Police Department now had to build a prosecutable case against a man who had committed a murder 30 years earlier. In an era when most of the witnesses were dead, the original note had gone missing, and the defense would argue that decades of evidence storage created reasonable doubt. The clock that had been silent for 30 years was ticking again. The case was assigned to cold case detective Doug Heraut. Heraut had started in law enforcement with the Douglas County Sheriff's Department in 1996, moved to the Omaha Police Department, and became a detective in 2005. The Bonnet case was about to become the defining investigation of his career. Heraut was not working alone. He coordinated with crime lab criminalist Steve Vaccaro and Nebraska State Patrol analysts Angela Adel and Kim Vanden Acker. Together, they began reconstructing a case that was older than some of them. The first priority was tracing Jerry Watson's life and establishing his connection to both Omaha and Cicero, Illinois. The picture that emerged was damning in its geography. Watson grew up in Cicero, just blocks from where Carol Bonnet's stolen 1964 Buick had been recovered in October 1978. He had a relative living in Omaha, someone he visited in the fall of 1978. He was 19 years old at the time of the murder, young, transient, and already involved in criminal activity. After the killing, he drifted through different states, living at times in Florida and elsewhere, using alias names to stay ahead of his past. He continued committing burglaries. He continued getting arrested. And each arrest added his fingerprints to databases that were slowly, invisibly, building the net that would eventually catch him. By the time Laura Casey identified his prints in December 2008, Watson was 50 years old and sitting in Lawrence Correctional Center in Illinois, serving time on yet another burglary conviction. He was nearing release. On December 2, 2009, Detective Heraut flew to Illinois to confront the man whose fingerprints had been found inside Carol Bonnet's apartment. Watson agreed to talk. He admitted he had been in Omaha in 1978. He acknowledged the city, the time frame, the visit to his relative. But he denied the murder. and he did so with a confidence that bordered on contempt. Watson told Heraut, "I know that you can't have evidence that said I did it. You know? 'Cause I know I didn't." Watson was playing the same game he'd played for 30 years. He believed the evidence didn't exist. He believed that time had erased whatever trail he'd left behind. He had no idea that the fingerprints he left on a bathroom door in 1978 had just been matched by a computer system that didn't exist when he left them. He had no idea about what was coming next. During that visit, Heraut obtained Watson's DNA sample, along with fresh fingerprints and palm prints. Then he flew back to Omaha with something investigators in 1978 could never have imagined would matter: a reference DNA sample from a suspect identified through a computer database. Ready to be compared against physical evidence preserved for more than 3 decades. The evidence had been sitting in the Omaha Police Department property room since 1978. Sealed evidence bags containing cigarette butts, beer cans, towels, and other items collected from the apartment and from the recovered Buick in Cicero. For 30 years, those items had been stored, untouched, waiting. Heraut sent them to the University of Nebraska Medical Center for DNA analysis using modern techniques that were science fiction when Carol Bonnet was alive. The results came back, and they were comprehensive. DNA profiles matching Jerry Watson were recovered from cigarette butts found inside Carol Bonnet's apartment. More matching DNA was recovered from cigarette butts found inside the stolen Buick in Cicero. A beer can from the kitchen wastebasket in the apartment also matched Watson's DNA, and a palm print from the medicine cabinet, the same cabinet Michael Stone had dusted 3 decades earlier, matched Watson. Each of these items placed Watson inside the apartment and inside the car at some point. The defense would later argue that this could have been innocent contact, that Bonnet was known to have guests, that Watson could have visited the apartment on a separate occasion. It was a reasonable defense theory given the passage of time. But then there was the hair. On one of the 3 towels found near Carol Bonnet's body, embedded in biological material lying beside the victim, investigators found a single hair. It was sent to the University of Nebraska Medical Center, along with everything else. The hair yielded a partial DNA profile. It matched Jerry Watson. The statistical weight of that match was staggering. The DNA profile from that hair could be found in 1 in 37.6 million Caucasians, 1 in 87.4 million African Americans, or 1 in 17.5 million Hispanic Americans. This was not a hair that could have been deposited during a casual visit weeks or months before the crime. It was found on material directly beside the body of the victim, in intimate proximity to Carol Bonnet, at the moment of his death. The cigarette butts placed Watson in the apartment. The beer can placed Watson in the kitchen. The palm print placed Watson at the medicine cabinet. The car recovery placed him on the route back to his hometown. The hair placed him at the body. And then Heraut found the clue. The killer's note had taunted police with the claim that he was leaving behind one clue for them to find. For 30 years, that boast had gone unanswered. The original note itself had been sent to the U.S. Secret Service for handwriting analysis at some point during the investigation and was never returned. It was, as far as anyone could determine, lost. But Heraut went back through every single item that had been cataloged from the crime scene. 3 newspapers had been collected near the body: an Omaha World Herald, a thrifty nickel classified paper, and an advertisement. Heraut examined them carefully. On the edge of one of the newspapers, in blue ink, written in cursive and then crossed out, were 2 words: Jerry W. The killer had written his own name at the crime scene. Then he'd scratched through it, probably assuming that the cross-out would make it unreadable, probably amused by the idea that his identity was right there in plain sight and no one would ever find it. He dared the police to find his clue. It was his own name. And it took a detective named Doug Heraut, working the case 30 years later, to finally see it. Retired technician Michael Stone later reflected on that discovery. "He just thought these guys are idiots," Stone said. "I'll go ahead and write my name on here, scratch it out. They'll never find it." Well, Doug found it. On November 15, 2010, Jerry Watson was officially charged with first-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony in the killing of Carol Bonnet. An amended charge filed on July 11, 2011 expanded the first-degree murder count to include both premeditated murder and felony murder committed during the course of a robbery. The trial began on August 16, 2011, in Douglas County District Court. The prosecution was led by Chief Deputy County Attorney Brenda Beadle. Watson's defense was handled by the Douglas County Public Defender's Office. From the start, this was a trial shaped by the passage of time in ways that most murder cases never have to confront. 33 years had elapsed between the crime and the courtroom. Most of the people who had direct knowledge of Carol Bonnet's life in 1978, the people who frequented the same bars, the people who visited his apartment, the people who might have seen a stranger in the building that week, were gone. 11 police reports from 1978 witnesses had to be read into the record because the witnesses themselves were dead or otherwise unavailable to testify. The prosecution was building a case from physical evidence and expert testimony, not eyewitness accounts. The witnesses who could testify were the surviving professionals. A firefighter who had responded to the call on October 17, 1978, took the stand and described forcing the apartment door open. The pathologist who performed the autopsy explained the cause of death: the single stab wound. Michael Stone, the retired crime lab technician, described lifting the fingerprints 33 years earlier. A Cicero evidence technician discussed the recovery of the stolen Buick. And then came the forensic experts. Fingerprint analysts walked the jury through the IAFIS match. DNA analysts presented the results from the cigarette butts, the beer can, the palm print, and the hair. Laura Casey described entering the old print into the database and getting the hit. Doug Herout traced the investigation from the December 2008 identification through the interview with Watson and the discovery of the cursive signature on the newspaper. The courtroom dynamics were unusual in a way that only a decades-old case can produce. The jury was being asked to consider events from before many of them were born. The apartment where the crime occurred had likely changed hands many times. The bars where Bonnet spent his evenings may no longer have existed. The Omaha of 1978 was a city that most people in the courtroom had never known. And yet the evidence, preserved in sealed bags and temperature-controlled storage for 33 years, was being presented as if the crime had happened yesterday. The defense had limited options, but they used them strategically. Watson's attorneys highlighted the challenges of prosecuting a case this old. They pointed to problems in the evidence chain that had accumulated over 3 decades of storage. One evidence bag, they noted, contained a concert T-shirt from a 1983 Def Leppard tour, an item that could not have been present at a 1978 crime scene. The implication was that evidence had been mixed, contaminated, or improperly stored over the years. They also pointed to the missing note. The killer's taunting message, arguably the most dramatic piece of evidence in the case, was gone. It had been sent to the U.S. Secret Service for handwriting analysis and never returned. Without the physical note, the defense argued, the prosecution was relying on descriptions and photographs of an item the jury could never examine firsthand. The defense's broader argument centered on reasonable doubt through alternative access. Carol Bonnet was known to invite people to his apartment. Multiple men had stayed there. One had a key to his car. Watson's DNA and fingerprints could have been left during a visit unrelated to the murder, they argued. The passage of 33 years made it impossible to establish a precise timeline for when the biological evidence was deposited. The prosecution dismantled that argument with the hair. Everything else could theoretically be explained by innocent contact at a different time. The cigarette butts, the beer can, the palm print, all of those could have been left during a social visit, the defense argued. But the hair on the towel next to the body, embedded in biological material lying beside the victim, could not. That evidence placed Watson at the body, not in the apartment at some unspecified time, at the body, at the moment that mattered. Combined with the fingerprints on the bathroom door, consistent with someone washing blood off their hands, combined with the car driven directly to Watson's hometown in Cicero, combined with the DNA match across multiple items, and combined with his own name scratched onto a newspaper at the scene, the circumstantial case became overwhelming. The jury listened to approximately a week and a half of testimony. When they retired to deliberate, they needed only a few hours. On August 25, 2011, the jury found Jerry Watson guilty of first-degree murder and the use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony. Watson had told Detective Heraut, "I know that you can't have evidence that said I did it." He was wrong. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for October 17, 2011. Anyone involved in the case understood the significance of that date. October 17, 1978 was the day Carol Bonnet's body was discovered. Now, exactly 33 years later, on the same date, the man who killed him would learn his fate. Whether the date was chosen deliberately or fell there by the workings of the court calendar, it carried a weight that everyone in the courtroom felt. 33 years of silence. 33 years of a case that went nowhere. 33 years of a killer walking free, living his life, committing more crimes, never once made to answer for the life he took in a downtown Omaha apartment. The judge sentenced Jerry Watson to life in prison for the first-degree murder conviction. An additional sentence of 10 to 20 years was imposed for the use of a deadly weapon charge. Watson, now 52 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He had been free for 33 years, from the age of 19 to the age of 52. He had lived more of his life as a free man after the murder than Carol Bonnet had lived at all after Watson entered his apartment. That math is difficult to sit with. Carol Bonnet got 0 more years. Jerry Watson got 33. And now the system that failed to catch him in 1978 was finally, permanently, taking those years back. Carol Bonnet's murder was, at the time, the oldest cold case ever solved by the Omaha Police Department. Watson did not go quietly. He appealed his conviction to the Nebraska Supreme Court, arguing that the 33-year delay between the crime and the indictment violated his constitutional rights. His attorneys contended that the passage of time had destroyed his ability to mount a proper defense, that witnesses had died, that evidence had degraded, and that the delay itself was fundamentally unfair. The Nebraska Supreme Court disagreed. On March 15, 2013, the court upheld the conviction in a detailed opinion that addressed each of Watson's claims systematically. The central finding was direct and in many ways poetic in its logic. The delay was not caused by prosecutorial misconduct or intentional foot-dragging. It was caused by the fact that the technology required to identify Watson simply did not exist in 1978. The court noted that IAFIS did not become operational until 1999, more than 2 decades after the crime, and that the Omaha Cold Case Unit was not formed until 2008. The state had acted promptly once the identification was made. IAFIS was not operational until 1999. The Cold Case Unit was not formed until 2008. And Watson's own later criminal activity was what placed his fingerprints into the system that ultimately matched them to the crime scene. The court also rejected Watson's argument that the evidence was insufficient to support the conviction. The fingerprints, the DNA from multiple sources, the hair near the body, the car in Cicero, and the cursive signature on the newspaper formed a body of evidence that the court found more than adequate. Watson tried again in 2017, filing a motion for post-conviction relief that alleged 9 separate claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. He argued his attorneys should have hired independent DNA experts, should have investigated another suspect more thoroughly, should have challenged the missing note more aggressively. On February 10, 2017, the Nebraska Supreme Court denied every claim. Jerry Watson remains in prison today. His appeals are exhausted. The case is closed. On August 24, 2012, the FBI presented its annual Latent Hit of the Year award to Laura Casey and Detective Doug Heraut of the Omaha Police Department. The award recognized the most significant latent fingerprint identification made through IAFIS in a given year. The FBI also produced a documentary-style video about the case featuring Casey, Heraut, Chief Deputy County Attorney Brenda Beadle, and retired crime lab technician Michael Stone. It was a rare moment of public recognition for the kind of work that usually happens in fluorescent-lit labs and windowless offices. The people who solved Carol Bonnet's murder were not television detectives. They were technicians, analysts, and investigators who did their jobs with patience and precision, often without any guarantee that the work would pay off. Laura Casey entered a 30-year-old fingerprint into a database and changed the outcome of a murder case. She had joined the Omaha Crime Lab in 1995, years before the Bonnet case landed on her desk. She described it as the most memorable case of my career. But what made it memorable wasn't just the result. It was the fact that the evidence had been there all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right system at the right time. Doug Heraut took a fingerprint match and built it into a conviction. He traveled to Illinois, confronted a killer who thought he was untouchable, collected the DNA that sealed the case, and found the clue that the killer himself had bragged about leaving behind. The work was painstaking. Heraut had to reconstruct a life story from 30-year-old records, trace Watson's movements across multiple states, coordinate DNA analysis with the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and build a prosecution file that could withstand the defense's inevitable challenges about evidence age and chain of custody. He did all of it. We were able to find a murderer who for 30 years thought he had gotten away with it, Heraut said. The team around him mattered too. Steve Vaccaro in the crime lab, Angela Adel and Kim Vanden Acker at the Nebraska State Patrol, Brenda Beadle in the county attorney's office. The unnamed Florida law enforcement official whose fax in December 2008 prompted the search in the first place. Solving a 30-year-old murder is not a one-person job. It's a chain, and every link held. And Michael Stone, the man who started it all without ever knowing how it would end. Stone was 28 years old when he dusted that bathroom door in Carol Bonnet's apartment. He lifted the print, initialed the card, and spent years comparing it against every record he could access. He retired without a match. He stepped away from the job, knowing that the answer might never come. When it finally did, Stone captured the entire story in a single observation. Technology had to catch up with the evidence that we had. That sentence is the lesson of this case. The evidence was always there. The fingerprints were always there. The DNA was always there, preserved in cigarette butts and beer cans and a single hair. The killer's own name was always there, scratched in cursive on a newspaper beside the body. Every piece of the puzzle was collected, cataloged, and stored within days of the murder in October 1978. The science just wasn't ready yet. When it was, it took less than 5 hours to solve a 30-year-old murder. 5 hours against 30 years. That ratio tells you everything about the difference between having evidence and having the technology to use it. The answer was always there. It was sitting in a sealed bag in a property room, written in the invisible language of ridge patterns and DNA sequences, waiting for the world to learn how to read it. There is a gap in this story that is difficult to talk about but important to acknowledge. In all the coverage of this case, in the court opinions, in the FBI video, in the news articles, in every account that has been published about the solving of Omaha's oldest cold case, almost nothing is said about the people who loved Carol Bonnet. No named surviving family members appear in any public record. No interviews with relatives or friends were quoted in the press coverage. No victim impact statement from the sentencing hearing has been published. The story of Carol Bonnet's murder has been told almost entirely through the lens of forensic science, fingerprint databases, DNA analysis, and the investigators who used those tools to bring his killer to justice. And those things matter. They matter enormously. Without the work of Michael Stone, Laura Casey, Doug Heraut, Steve Vaccaro, and the analysts who supported them, this case would still be open. Without IAFIS, Jerry Watson would have lived and died a free man. The forensic achievement is real, and it is significant. But so is this. Carol Bonnet was a real person. He was born on January 13, 1917, which means he lived through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the post-war boom, through the social upheaval of the 1960s, through the entire arc of 20th century American life. He was 61 years old. He had seen more of the world than most people. He went to work at a hospital where people were cared for. He came home to a clean apartment. He bought drinks for people at bars. He let acquaintances borrow his car. He was generous in ways that made him vulnerable, and that vulnerability cost him his life. We don't know if he had siblings. We don't know if he had close friends who mourned him for decades. We don't know if anyone sat in that courtroom on October 17, 2011, and finally exhaled after 33 years of waiting. The public record is silent on all of it, and that silence is its own kind of injustice. For 33 years, his name existed primarily as a label on a case file, a case number, a box in a property room, a fingerprint card with no match. That is the quiet cruelty of a cold case. It is not just that the killer goes free, it is that the victim fades. The longer a case stays open, the more the person at the center of it disappears behind the evidence, the procedure, the technology. Carol Bonnet was not a fingerprint. He was not a DNA sample. He was not the subject of a taunting note. He was a man who lived for 61 years and deserved to be known for how he lived, not only for how his life ended. The forensic story of this case is remarkable. The human story, what little of it survives in the public record, is what makes it worth telling. Carol Bonnet deserved better than 33 years of silence. On October 17, 2011, exactly 33 years after his body was found on the floor of his apartment, a judge sentenced his killer to life in prison. The case that everyone assumed would stay buried came back. The fingerprints that couldn't be matched in 1978 were matched in 2008. The DNA that didn't exist as a forensic tool when Bonnet was alive confirmed the identification decades later. And the clue the killer dared police to find, his own name written at the crime scene, was found by a detective who refused to leave a single piece of evidence unexamined. Some cases close. This one came full circle. Carol Bonnet. Born January 13, 1917. Found October 17, 1978. Justice delivered October 17, 2011. Remembered here. This is Cold Case Redemption. We tell the stories of the people who waited the longest for justice and the investigators who refused to let them be forgotten. If you believe victims like Carol Bonnet deserve to be remembered, subscribe. We'll see you in the next case.